Welcome to Take a Seat, where we sit down with experts on a wide range of topics related to the science of human flourishing. Together, we're going to explore topics that can help us level up, give us hope, and maybe even make us feel optimistic about the future and our ability to live good lives both individually and collectively. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Holton. I'm a coach, consultant, and speaker in the field of optimal human functioning, but I'm most passionate about science and stories that can help us create a better system of education, one that leads individuals to the greatest angels of their nature and builds stronger societies as a result. Together with the Shipley School, a global leader in educating for flourishing, we're happy to have you join us. Whether you're someone trying to build your best self or a better community, we've got something for you, so take a seat. Hello, everybody. Welcome back in to Take a Seat. On this episode, we sat down with executive coach Fredricka Brecht. Fred is such an incredible woman with a prestigious history. She's a former executive herself, though she spent the better part of the past 2 decades as an award-winning coach to groups of C-suite executives for Vistage, one of the world's largest and premier executive coaching firms. Our conversation dug into some of her insights from years of experience with highly intelligent, motivated leaders, along with some of the conscious and effective practices she helps them employ. We touched on the importance of having grace and emotional intelligence as a part of one's leadership style, and perhaps most importantly, understanding that caring about all the stakeholders of a community or organization is one of the surest paths to success and fulfillment. Fred shared some strategies for harnessing this beautiful power of collective action and well-being, the neurochemistry it causes, and the ultimate satisfaction and success it leads to. It was a fascinating conversation filled with insights for anyone looking to become a better leader of a team, business, or institution, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So without further ado, here is our conversation with executive coach and all-around rock star, Fredricka Brecht. Nice to see you.
Well, yeah, very nice. Hanging in there. Had a nice holiday trip up to the Hudson Valley. That's where the kids live. And they have a 2.5-year-old, so it's really entertaining. How long you been hanging around Shipley?
About 5-6 months. I was in Los Angeles for the last 12 years. I'm originally from Michigan and made the transition sort of middle of the pandemic. Started kind of interviewing in March or maybe April and left LA in June, spent a month in Michigan, and got out to Philly in July. And enjoying it. It's a great area.
Well, it is a great area, and I think Shipley has quite a history. Are you enjoying that?
Loving it. The more I meet alumni, the more I see how courage for the deed, grace for the doing has really stuck with people. There's an actual kind of this is the sort of human beings we think we should be. And clearly Shipley has sharpened that on some level for a lot of folks, which has been pretty cool for me as a newcomer.
Yeah, I would sure agree with that. I mean, during the pandemic, myself and 4 other Shipley, I'm going to say girls, we get together twice a month for a Zoom hour. It's hard to describe the depth of those friendships. But, these are your formative years. And so it's interesting. As a group, we have not had a discussion about courage for the deed, grace for the doing. I think we sort of take it for granted. It is something that I have shared in a lot of my work with my CEOs and business work. And there's something about it that's so compelling. Courage is a word that's very straightforward. That's kind of easy for us to understand what it's calling us to do. Grace has so many nuances and is in fact more challenging. And in a couple of the conversations I've had with Shipley, I've commented on how grace is what's matures and develops over time. But Shipley sets you up by putting that motto in front of you. It predestines you to recognize that that's what's called for, or that's what might be going on in this moment. So putting that in the head of a third grader might not have a lot of impact.
Well, to your point though, you wonder, like, the language in my world would be like self-fulfilling prophecies, right? You wonder what happens when you sort of help, set beliefs or influence beliefs sort of in an early stage, right? Like, this, it's just sort of like, this is how it's supposed to go. This is how I'm supposed to be, whatever it might be, right?
Right. So it is interesting. There has been, over the last decade or so, a tremendous amount of work done in the business community about how more efficient, effective, competitive organizations are that employ, I'm going to call it grace. They don't necessarily use the word grace.
We Shipley really care about the scientific application of all this new research and grace, and giving behavior and conscious organizations and conscious leadership as it applies to education, of course. And that's why I'm at Shipley, right? But at the same time, I think, the show is not necessarily secluded to a conversation about education. It's really like, how can we talk about these things in ways so that people listening, Shipley grads or not, take something beneficial from it, right? And I think what you just alluded to is a really good place to start. The language I would use that I'm kind of familiar with is conscious capitalism.
There's an entire organization. You know the organization, Conscious Capitalism. I've been to one of their events. A couple of my Vistage members are members of it.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the data. I think, I've gone through the book a couple times. I think one of the things they cited in their research from Firms of Endearment is that over, I think, of maybe a 1, 3, or 1, 5, and 15-year period, a lot of these conscious organizations, they outperform the market, in some cases by 10.5 to 1, right? Is
Yep,
suggesting
they
it's
do.
not really an either or equation, right? Profit or people. If done right, it really can be both.
Yeah. Well, Sinek lays out in one of his books some of the science behind it, being the release of oxytocin, the whole list of what happens to the person who is being kind or generous with a coworker, that's released inside them, not the person, and perhaps the person who's receiving the kindness is as well. But it talks about it being addictive, and that once you can get this going in your organization, it blossoms, because there is, and he lays it out very clearly. He says there is an addictive nature to once you get this going.
A real network effect, right?
Yeah, or I would call it an accelerator effect, because if you have several people who experience it, the rest of the organization can start to feel it, and it grows. Now, there's another organization maybe you're familiar with, Nick, that's done a lot of work, lots of work in this area, called the Arbinger Institute.
I'm not familiar with them.
Okay, there are 3 books that they have out. The first was called The Anatomy of Peace. The second is Leadership and Self-Deception. And the last is The Outward Mindset. They have 35 years of research behind this, and they do work with lots of organizations, nonprofits, faith-based businesses, and so on. What they are teaching is how much more effective and efficient your organization is if people respond to each other from a position where each individual is actually aware of and cares about the objective and needs of the other people. If they come at, let's say they're addressing a problem, or they're trying to capitalize on an opportunity and they address it from the position of what's in it for me, they don't get near as much ingenuity, collaboration, et cetera, from the other people. Now, you can see where this goes off the rails, where other people can sense it. And in fact, their coworkers are put in a defensive posture because this person always has to be right. Those people have to be dealt with.
There's no people like that in businesses, are there?
Yeah. Well, the free market capitalism is better for competition itself, but competition requires us to be effective, efficient. That's one of the factors of competition, is the productivity of your firm. And Arbinger's argument is your productivity is going to be a whole lot higher if people work together in this collaborative mode where they can put themselves in the seat of the other people they're working with. And frankly, Nick, you and I know that that's also a form of grace. But they have documented, and they now have an entire business teaching this, just like Cynic, about how more effective these organizations are. And in my work with CEOs, and I'm going to admit with some clergy, it's a certain point in their career that they realize this, as they rise to the top, there's a certain point of their career, and I've shared this with Shipley before, where they realize that they may have all of the authority in an organization, but they don't really have most of the power. Their employees have the power. What they have is authority. And all of a sudden, there's this wonderful guy, Zig Ziglar. Have you read any of his stuff? Oh, well, I always use his quote. I printed it out here. He says, "You don't build a business, you build people. People built the business." And it's kind of interesting when you see us realize that. It's some people get it early, and some people, it's a big discovery.
It is, and it seems like it shouldn't be, because on the most basic level, what you're really talking about is like team dynamics and how I work with a teammate, right? Which, coming from a coaching background and athletics background, like that's sort of the first level. But really then what you're talking about is empathy, which makes sense because we would all, I'm thinking of Michael Sandel, who teaches justice courses at Harvard, and he talks about John Rawls and sort of behind the veil of ignorance. Like, if we didn't know how things were going to work out, how would we make rules? We would make rules in ways where it's like, if I don't know if I'm going to be on the bad end of this, right, then I want to make sure things are in place so that I get treated, with a certain degree of humanity. And I think empathy is a part of that, but you've taken it a step further and said, and Cynic has said it as well, compassion, because empathy can lead to some burnout if you carry people's problems, right? But compassion, how are you behaving with grace in a way that really amplifies things around you?
Yeah. And I find that a lot of leaders never imagined that this was going to be part of their skill set to be successful.
There's a large degree of emotional intelligence to that, wouldn't you say?
Right. Yep. And I was on the board of a seminary, and I joined that board. I think I shared with Shipley before that once I learned about this peer group effectiveness in the business community, I set it up for clergy. There are a number of clergy at bishop level and so on who are members of Vistage, because they face the same challenges. Yes, there are challenges that have to do with the industry itself that you are in, but a great deal of your challenges as you scale up is learning how to drive the success of the employees. And you may set the vision, you may set the strategy, but they're the execution. And that's a challenge and plenty of nonprofits, by the way, are in Vistage. I have a nonprofit in there, but it's the challenge of effective organizations is existent in any organization, don't you think?
Yeah, 100%. And so that makes me curious, will you tell us a bit more about, you've mentioned it a couple times and we're kind of going through the conversation backwards here, which is okay, but will you just tell us a bit about what Vistage is and sort of practically, but also philosophically, right? And sort of what that might look like.
I'll tell you the story of how it started, and it
Please.
frankly explains everything.
Great.
1957, a guy in Wisconsin, he's making some kind of home goods. He gets an order from Montgomery Ward, and he's like, I have arrived. This will make my future, Montgomery Ward.
I love it.
So he puts in a lot of additional production capacity. He spends a lot of money to do this, so on and so on. 2 weeks before he's ready to ship, Montgomery Ward informs him that they have eliminated that entire category from their stores.
Oh.
And he didn't have a take or pay contract or anything like that. He's dead. So he says to himself, man, before I did that, I could have used some advice. So he goes out and he recruits 10 or 11 other CEOs in the Milwaukee area. And he says, we should get together and talk to, and none of them are in the same industry. So there are no competitors, no suppliers, vendors, any of that kind of stuff. He says, boy, would it have helped me to run this past somebody. So he starts the first Vistage group, which starts sharing their triumphs and their failures and learning from each other. And it was a monthly meeting, and it started as a half day and then it grew. And so he was up in the Midwest, upper Midwest, and it just grew like wildfire because Nick, it's so sensible. And it's so easy to start one, right? How hard is that? So it grows and grows and grows. And then some people out in California say, this is big, it needs to grow faster, and there's an opportunity here. We're going to own it. So they buy it from the guy, not that he was making much in the way of profits. But anyway, so they accelerate it and they start adding things like, when they talked to the members said, hey, we need to have this for some of our executives. So they started key executive groups. The previous owners said, these people are meeting every month to work on accelerating each other's success. Let's add an educational element to it. So they started bringing in speakers. So the Simon Sinek's and the people like that start becoming speakers in these Vistage groups. Now, these Vistage groups are tiny. It's no more than 16 people. Imagine you spend a morning with one of these terrific speakers who's educating you. And by the way, it can be about leadership. It's also about marketing. It's also about sales management, HR, all kinds of different issues. But so you get an industry expert, not an industry expert, a discipline expert, who spends the whole morning with you, and you're getting to ask them questions, you're getting to do case studies with it. So every year we chairs have a conference where we get together to share best practices and so on.
And will you explain for folks, what a chair is? I know I believe the language is master chair. I believe you won the master chair award in maybe 2013. You can correct me on that, but what is a chair and what is this group? And then maybe, people might be familiar with kind of like YPO, mastermind, those sort of things, but it strikes me that Vistage is something quite different. So maybe some of those details.
Yeah. Vistage does not. So Vistage is in these small groups, and they are facilitated by somebody who's called a chair. We run the meetings, we set the agendas, We sign up the speakers. We recruit new members. We are in charge of quality control. Nick, sometimes we have to fire a member.
Understand. I know about that. Yeah.
But anyway, so we run we run these groups. Originally, the leaders, the chairs of these groups also had their own businesses, but as the chairing and the facilitation became more and more involved with more and more deliverables to the members, they became people who were distinct from the members. One of the things that was added was one-on-one coaching. So for my members, we have the monthly meeting, but then each of them has a 2-hour session with me every month where I'm following up on, you know, their strategic agenda, what they're learning, how they're applying it, et cetera, et cetera. I will also say that sometimes an individual member will have a really pressing need, and a subset of the members will form something we call a tiger team to work with that member to get them through their crisis, whether it's financial, whether it's people, whatever it is. So they're really very generous with each other. So there was a point in time, I think I was made, I won an award when I had 2 CEO groups, 1 COO group, you know, key executive, and then 4 groups where companies formed internal groups. Those are actually harder to run because those are people who work together. So that was too much. Anyway, but I won an award for that. And Master Chair, I believe, is by meeting performance standards in terms of retention and size of your groups, that kind of thing, over some sustained number of years, and then they give you an award.
So you are facilitating these groups of essentially C-suite executives, primarily CEOs and CEOs, number ones, number twos, right? The general goal is, you know, collective and individual acceleration, good to great, peak performance. And you've been so good at it that you've won an award because of retention and people want to come back. And clearly that suggests they feel like they are accelerating. So that leads me to this question. What do you believe people, generally speaking, really benefit from accelerating at? What are you maybe teaching? What can people at home take from and sort of learn from you when it comes to good to great and kind of leveling up?
I would say that being successful in any endeavor comes down to people, strategy, and money, right? You can't ignore the money. My members see their financial results every month. I have them in 12-month running trend lines. Everybody knows how everybody's doing. So there's no hiding.
Well, what would be some tangible takeaways for folks that maybe would be talked about? If you look at one of your groups and you say this has been successful, right? What does that success look like? And what we're hearing so far is people, strategy, money, but really, like, what are we doing with and for those things?
So on strategy, working with your group to develop a compelling strategy, you know, that makes you a better competitor is key. So you've got a room full of these smart people assessing your strategy or helping you develop one. You know, you can do that just within your company, or you can do that with a consultant, but how about doing that with 15 other CEOs? That's awesome. So they've got to have a compelling vision, a strategy that is going to make them the better competitor in their marketplace, and the people to execute on that strategy. So if I see that people are gaining market share, that they do in fact have a better strategy than their competitors, that they have a vision, that is compelling to their employee base. I mean, you got to motivate everybody.
Start with why.
Yes. And then part of their maturing and part of what they learn from each other is how to serve their people, how to make their people successful. Many people come to this having relied on themselves personally to be successful. And they're uncomfortable with, when you scale up, you have to start relying on others. And others aren't going to do it exactly the way you would have. And you have to figure out how to use that as an opportunity. This is a whole new set of skills from as compared to the day when you founded your company off of some brilliant idea, right?
Yep. So two questions. That one is I want to repeat, the quote I heard you put out so beautifully on, I think it was Texas Business Radio. And just for context, you're in Houston, right? Greater Southwest Texas area, right? And on this episode, I was watching a little bit, kind of doing research for the show, and you said, quote, "People are at their best when they're in service of others," end quote. And you also just suggested that there is, I think, maybe a skill set that helps people kind of appropriately and effectively be their best selves in service of others. And I'd love to hear you just sort of expand on what you mean by that quote a little bit and what you think some of those key skills are.
Well, I would say, Nick, a lot of that goes back to what we have been talking about with the principles that Sinek did a good job of laying out. Your work eventually is more enjoyable. As he said, you get more endorphins and oxytocin and all that kind of stuff when you are serving others. And there's a point at which you will see leaders experience tremendous joy when they see their organization evolve, when they see the thrill that their employees experience as their employees are develop and as their employees succeed. And it causes them, when they have that joy of service, it causes them to frankly get sharper and sharper about it. But it's not a simple thing like, I can figure out how to optimize a production line with mathematics, right? I can't figure out inspiring an entire organization with mathematics. This stuff that Sinek is teaching and conscious capitalism and the Arbinger Institute, this stuff that they are teaching is difficult. It's hard, and this is what I go back to. The courage part of our motto is the easiest part. Grace is hard. So I think that that's what's going on when people are in service to others. That is the grace. And it's not simple to learn.
It occurs to me, and I feel somewhat compelled to point out, one of the things I think we at Shipley believe is really critical to this definition of flourishing, right? Like feeling good and performing well, right? Is collective well-being and a sense of collectiveness. And in these kind of primary threads we're going through, one is your Vistage groups, right? That is a living, breathing example of that kind of we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Like, we don't flourish in a vacuum, right? So who we surround ourselves with, right? But then when you go to the organizational level and say, okay, that's great, CEOs and CEOs, but we're really, what I think I'm hearing is a little bit of a pushback against maybe just this rugged individualism, and saying, like, we are going to be more effective if we get there together. And that means caring about not only each other, but what we're putting out into the world and what we're putting out into the market.
Yep. And Sinek contends it's addictive once you get good at it. That it's hard, but once you get good at it, you can just keep getting better. And it's a really enjoyable way of life.
It speaks to, I think, so we had a couple episodes ago, we had another alumni, Lydia Denworth. I don't know if you know Lydia's work. Lydia just wrote a terrific book called Friendship that's on the Next Big Idea Club, among other, notable outlets. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I
What's the
thought of
name?
it,
What's the title again?
Friendship.
Okay.
I believe the subtitle is something like The Biology of Life's Most Fundamental Bond, something along those lines. And guess what? What you were talking about earlier, right, with your group of girls that you get together with monthly, one of the things she mentions about the science of friendship is often there is shared history. And almost always there is similarity and reciprocity, right? But I mention it to really say, like, to me, you are really tapping into, I think, what we're seeing from psychology, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, which is like how we relate to other people is not just sort of influential, it's a core need. And it's something that we can really understand and tap into and leverage in ways that create positive outcomes. So what does that look like in a Vistage group? How might you go about, you've said to people, I believe, right, as your master chair, that people are at their best when they're in service of others. How might you try to help your people understand that?
Here's something that makes it easy for me is that Vistage has something like 1,800 speakers that I can hire through Vistage. So I have a tremendous choice. And by the way, here's been one of the advantages of Zoom. So we used to get together in person every month. Now we're meeting on Zoom. Well, the great thing about having my speaker be on Zoom is that they can invite a whole lot of their critical employees to sit in on the learning. So
that's really cool.
I can bring in speakers who address exactly this topic. So for instance, early on, before he was hyper famous, Simon Sinek. Last week, I had somebody from the Arbinger Institute teaching them the outward mindset and explaining them how this outward thinking versus inward thinking accelerates the success of the business, but also accelerates their own well-being. So I got an outside resource. I don't have to be the resource on this. And by the way, it's much more effective if it's an outside expert who comes in and talks to them about it. Now, what's powerful is then after the outside expert leaves, as a group, before we get to processing, part of what you do in a Vistage meeting is you process specific issues that a member may have. Like somebody's having trouble recruiting, a guy has a big apartment industry, he's having a hard time recruiting leasing managers, and he has a discussion with his members about, help me, here's what I'm doing, what more could I be doing, blah, blah, blah. So they'll bring a specific issue to each other to process. But before we get to that work, we process what they learned in the morning. So we have a discussion across these folks about, what was your reaction to this? Where have you seen this? To what extent are you doing this now? Where do you need to get better? What actions are you going to take to make this effective? So that whole process from learning to implementation is aided by the discussion between the members.
And I assume the chair is kind of the coaching figure as well, right?
Because so those people who had talked to this wonderful, listened to this wonderful trainer last week, this week I'm having one-to-one sessions with them. So I get to have a personal conversation with it about where do you want to go from here. Now, some of these speakers are of the variety where they actually can offer a program. So one of these guys is planning to hire someone from Arbinger to train a couple of his people train on this topic within the company. So this is not your typical speaker. I mean, we're not spending every month talking about this interpersonal behavior, but examples of it keep coming up. Like one guy processed an issue with the group where he said, I need to do more in acknowledging the success of my employees. I'm thinking of adding an award where I acknowledge their success in the company's monthly meeting. What are you guys doing? So they share with each other the approach they take. Some people, the award is given to somebody who did the most of X. Some people, their employee that's going to be acknowledged is actually voted on by the executive team. But anyway, they compare notes on what's been effective about it and what hasn't been. So they have each other to share that kind of information with.
You have this really nice balance, it seems, of, there are costs and benefits to group interaction and to one-on-one interaction. And your group and Vistage seems to really do both. I'm curious what some of the advantages are that you've seen that might be applied, because you mentioned nonprofits, right? That might be applied to really helping schools, and a school like Shipley, think about culture and leadership and the academic program, and things of that nature. Is that something you've ever, given some thought to?
Well, it's interesting. There's a fellow here in Houston named Chris Barbick that started KIP. And Yes Prep was also started here. And the idea schools were started here, and they're really, really taken off. And so Chris had asked me to meet with this organization to simply spill my guts and say, here's how Vistage works, so that they could basically adopt everything out of Vistage that would be helpful for them. And around the country, I got a number of other chairs to kind of coach them as they were getting these best practice peer groups up, that were principally for the CEOs of charter schools. I don't know as much about what the private schools are doing. It would certainly, you know what? Now I just remembered something. When I started up the peer groups for clergy, one of the facilitators up in East Texas said, boy, could school principals use this. It was headquartered out of Tyler, Texas, and it was about 8 principals from around that area. I don't know if this peer group is still going, but it makes a lot of sense. Now, what's the challenges among charter schools and private schools? They can see each other as competitors. So if you put Baldwin, Agnes Irwin, Springfield, and Shipley in the same group, they have to adopt the attitude that if all of us were excellent and got better, we win together.
Win-win. Yep.
Win-win.
Yep. The language we kind of put around that at Shipley, because I think that is a philosophical, priority for our head of school, Michael Turner, is, we tell that story that was in the Times and then got released in Sean Akers' book, Big Potential, about fireflies, right? And that when fireflies flash in sync, right, as kind of a win-win sort of approach, their chances of successfully attracting a mate go up by something like 80%, right? It's a fundamental difference in how you view sort of, I guess the word is not, competition, but collaboration, right? Like, okay, we're in the same market, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to be, super chickens and rivals.
So now I'll tell you who has made some progress on this. Patrick Lencioni. He is on the board of an organization, I think it's out of Palo Alto, that focuses on peer groups for clergy. And I turned my administration of this stuff over to them. They were so good. I think they may have started some interfaith groups. But I will tell you, the sense of competition couldn't get these church leaders into even interdenominational groups. I couldn't sell them on it, Nick.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, some of that thinking I tend to feel on an individual and collective level, it's a little easier to think about the other when you feel like your own needs are secure. And on an organizational level, you know, I wonder the extent to which some of these organizations, nonprofits, institutions in the middle of a pandemic or whenever this was, right? If you're worried about membership and you're worried about sort of, you mentioned like money is one of those things, money, people, and strategy, right? It could be viewed, I think, as a position of privilege to be able to worry about other folks.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And look at higher academia, universities. So the professors come up through that in their fight to get tenure.
Yeah.
And look at how they treat each other in the publish or perish world. I mean, my roommate finished her in graduate school. She defended her thesis and she got her PhD. She went to Stanford now, so then Harvard, then Princeton. Her life in the publish or perish world, that those professors were so competitive with each other. It was not a satisfying life.
You are you familiar with, you know, Margaret Heffernan's TED Talk about super chickens and the study done at Purdue? And well, you know, we'll put it in the show notes, but I'll give you the long and short of it. She really kind of brought awareness to a study that was done in the 90s at Purdue. I believe the researcher is William Muir. And the long and short of it is basically he runs this controlled study where he takes a flock of chickens, leaves them to their own devices and tries to assess productivity and sort of like success, right? And how does he do that? Well, he counts the eggs.
Yeah.
And then he's got this other group, right? The treatment group that he's providing a treatment or a manipulation to. And what he does is he breeds the most productive chickens together. So in one group, you've got just kind of like natural order, if you will. And this other group, the only way you get to breed is if you're the top earner, more or less, right? And what he finds is after 6 generations, the control group that he had left alone is plump and feathered and these sorts of things, right? Doing fine. And the group, the treatment group, the super chickens, actually only a handful were left because they actually started to peck each other to death. Amazing, right? Amazing. So, you know, a lot of times I'll juxtapose these two stories. I've done it even at Shipley with, like, you know, fireflies or super chickens. Sometimes that's what it comes down to, I think. But that's what I heard when you laid out that scenario, right? Is sort of a like, if I have to worry about things that are fundamental to me, right, core needs, then I might be willing to peck somebody else, you know, metaphorically to death to get those needs.
Wow.
Right? And that's often what you see. And I would also kind of add to it, like, I worry about that in education. So, you know, I've seen examples, stories where, like, say a kid senior year misses a week or two of class and he comes back and his buddies won't help him get caught up. Won't tell him what he missed, won't give him notes, you know, won't give him kind of any review. Why? Well, they're applying to the same schools.
Got it.
That's super chickenish, right? And I think you're probably seeing that on some level, on an organizational level, right? Or even with these clergy.
Yeah. You absolutely could.
So let's Let's do this. I'd love to just ask you kind of some, fun, quicker one-off questions, and we can kind of wrap it up that way. So let's go ahead and go that route. Number one, you have a go-to exercise, a go-to activity that sort of helps you be your best self?
A go-to, a personal activity?
Yep. Well, it could be social, but something that you kind of like, you need to feel good, function well.
You made that earlier statement about you're influenced by the 5 people that you have around you. So I will make this comment relative to our COVID world. I'm in 2 Zoom groups, Zoom cocktail hours, and we get together every 2 weeks and we talk about all kinds of crazy stuff in our lives and all that kind of stuff. One of them is local, and I will tell you the other is made up of 5 Shipley girls.
Cool.
So that interchange, you can't give up your social interchange, as limited as we are with Zoom. So having that regularly scheduled, so that makes 4 Zoom cocktail parties a month.
Love it. So 2 things. One, I mentioned Lydia Denworth earlier, talking about friendship, right? She would call that like sharing the headlines, getting together and like going through sort of like the updates, right? And 2, probably the more interesting question is, what's your go-to cocktail?
Oh, I take crap for this, but I'm a Chardonnay person.
Nothing wrong with that. You like what you like.
Yeah, and I will tell you the old, when I was younger, there were cocktails, but I don't even mess with that anymore. When I went to Cornell, Nick, in 1968, the drinking age in New York was 18. So when I got to Cornell, you could have a beer at lunch. Here were all these kids in their freshman year that could all of a sudden drink, and we overdid it, by the way.
And you drink, you did.
Yeah, so there were some lessons learned about not overdoing it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You have a morning routine or an evening routine, maybe both? Are you kind of a creature of habit?
Well, here's one part of me that's a creature of habit. Before I start my day, where I'm on Zoom working with individual CEOs or working with groups, or I just got off of a meeting I really like reading the paper. I don't read it online. I like holding it in my hands. Now, I used to subscribe to so many different journals. So I read, one of the ones I read religiously was The Economist, but I've whittled down my subscriptions in terms of those I hold in my hand to The New Yorker. Lately, that's probably not been good for me since the topics addressed have been so depressing. But anyway, so my morning routine is coffee and reading the morning paper. And that sort of gets me started.
So, we'll kind of wrap it up here. I just, want to say, Fredricka Brecht, thank you so much for your time today. It was really, really lovely talking to you. We went all sorts of different directions, which were all kind of equally interesting, and it was a lot of fun.
Nick, I am so grateful that you are at Shipley.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say.
Whoever is the recruiter that found you, I love them.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. So it happens to be my boss, Dr. Sharon Russell, who you would appreciate, I believe was born in Liverpool. She's a Merseyside, so a fellow Brit like yourself.
Yeah. So. Awesome.
Our show is produced by the Shipley School, an independent pre-K through grade 12 day school, rethinking education and daring to hope that we can, in fact, build a better future. Come on and join us.